She came down off the stage at Quill Hollow, the way a woman steps onto ice she has already tested. One gloved hand light on the coach rail, and her eyes going first to the ground where her feet would land, and the loafing men on the store porch priced her in the single pass they gave every stranger and set her down as nothing. A plain widow in a plain dark dress, past her first youth, with one strapped trunk and a stillness about her that they read, being men who mistook noise for strength, as the meekness of a woman come west with nowhere left to go. They were wrong in the way men are often wrong about quiet things, and they would go on being wrong for the better part of a season. Her name was Wren Adeline Halloran, and she had not come to be grateful to anyone. Up in the high-fruit country above the town, Amos Trinny had posted a notice for a housekeeper the way a man orders seed from a catalog, a cook, a pair of hands, somebody plain and grateful to sweep the rooms and quiet the house that had been too silent since his wife died 2 winters back. And he had priced the whole matter in his ledger head at wages, and found, and nothing more. He believed he was hiring a drudge. He was hiring the one person in the county who could read a hive the way a doctor reads a pulse, who came out of 4 unbroken generations of Ohio beekeepers, who could bring his silent gray hives back to a roar and his barren apple trees back to fruit, and who would, before the year turned, uncover that the district's honey was being quietly robbed by the very man who bought it. Neither of them knew any of this yet. That is the whole of the story, and everything in it. If you've ever brought a dead thing back to life with patient hands, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. It was the spring of 1878 in the high-fruit country above Quill Hollow, Oregon, where the apple bloom came late and cold off the ridges, and a man's whole year could turn on, whether the blossoms set. Amos had ridden down with the wagon expecting to know his housekeeper on sight, a stout, weary, thankful sort of woman, the kind the notices always fetched. And when the tall, quiet widow with the level gray eyes said his name to him as a fact rather than a question, he very nearly told her there had been a mistake. He had it framed in his mouth. He was a careful man, ground careful, past the point of courage, and he had learned to dread anything that did not sit exactly where he had set it, and this woman did not sit where he had set her. He got as far as saying that he had written for a housekeeper, plain and simple, and that perhaps she had misunderstood the position. She did not argue. She reached into the small satchel she carried apart from the trunk and drew out a letter, folded soft with handling, and held it out to him, and it was his own crabbed hand, his own terms, wages and found agreed, the trial period named, answered and countersigned in a firm square script, W. Halloran. He looked at the initial a moment longer than he needed to, and understood, and did not say what he understood, which was that he had assumed a man and been answered by a woman who had let him assume it. She had signed it, W. Halloran, because she had twice before learned exactly what becomes of a letter signed with a woman's Christian name. When the work asked for is a man's work, she had watched a good position evaporate the instant a hiring man's eye caught the name Wren where he had expected a Walter, and she had decided, somewhere on a cold road years back, that she would let no man refuse her before she had stood in front of him, and that a signature was a small enough thing to bend. She said none of this. She only stood with the letter held out until he took it back, and said, in a voice level as a fresh drawn frame of comb, that she had come a long way and would as soon see the place. And Amos, who could think of no honest answer to a woman holding his own signed word in the road, put her trunk in the wagon and grunted at the surprising dead weight of it, and drove her up. The place told her everything on the way in, the way a farm always tells the truth to anyone who knows how to be told. She saw the farmhouse first, weathered gray and leaning a little off true at the porch post. Curtains hung right, but hung by a hand that had stopped caring whether they were seen. And she knew before she was through the door that no woman had run it in 2 years, and that a man had been keeping it just alive out of a stubbornness that had nothing hopeful left in it. She saw the orchard, and here her hands went still on her lap. Row on row of apple trees stood up the slope in their coming bloom, old grand trees planted with somebody's ambition long ago, and they were putting out blossom the way a healthy tree should, and she knew, looking at them, that come the count they would set almost nothing, that they had been blooming their hearts out into empty air for 3 seasons and dropping their promise unfulfilled, and that a man could stand in that orchard every spring of his life and never once understand why. And then at the orchard's lower edge she saw the hives, and everything in her that was 4 generations deep went cold and certain and quiet. A double row of them, gray box hives gone silvery and split with weather, and over the whole of that yard hung the one thing that told her the most, which was a silence. There was no hum. A strong bee yard in an April dusk has a sound to it, low and steady and warm as a kettle just off the boil, the sound of 10,000 small lives working, and a man raised near bees never hears it until it stops. It had stopped here. The hives stood in the failing light, making no sound at all, a row of little gray coffins at the foot of a barren orchard, and Wren Halloran looked at that dead quiet yard and felt the thing she always felt, which was not quite grief and not quite anger, but the two of them braided into a kind of resolve. And she thought, with the plain, flat clarity of a woman reading a page she has read 1,000 times, this place is not dying of bad luck. Down past the hives sat a low honey house built of stone, cold and shut, and she marked it too and said nothing. Amos, for his part, was doing the unhappy arithmetic a poor man does. He had a note held by the county bank coming due at harvest, and a crop that would not meet it, and he could no more afford to keep a housekeeper he had not needed than he could afford the 2 days' wages and the trouble of sending her back down to the stage, and under both of those hard sums lay a third he would not have owned to, which was that the house had gotten so quiet since Sarah that he had begun to talk to the stove, and here at last was another human voice that had not gone silent yet. He did the figures the whole way up and came out, as he had known he would, owing in every direction and able to pay in none, and so at the door he said the only thing left to a man in that fix. All right, he told her, on trial till the 1st of the month, and they would see. She said that would do. In the town they had watched the wagon go up the grade with the widow sitting straight beside the beaten-down orchardist, and a man on the porch had said, loud enough, that Amos Trine had gone and got himself a wife dressed up as a housekeeper, and another had said she wouldn't last past the first hard rain, and they had all of them, in one careless pass, weighed her and found her light, the way a rigged scale weighs everything light. They did not know that they had that day watched the one woman who could save the whole high district ride up out of their sight. Amos carried the trunk in himself and set it down at the foot of the narrow bed in the back room off the kitchen, and grunted at it again, and said she had brought a good many books for a housekeeper. She said only that she had. She did not tell him what lay folded in oilcloth under the plain apron, and the one good dark dress a widow keeps for burying and for weddings, a bee veil gone soft with years, a tin smoker with the bellows worn smooth, a hive tool and a comb knife, a small brass queen cage, and her father's beekeeping journal, its spine broken and its pages furred at the edges from 40 years of thumbs. The whole record of a trade carried west in a trunk, because there had been nowhere in her life to set it down. No one had asked her to keep a bee. There was no cause to mention any of it, and she had long since learned that a woman does not lay her real tools on the table the first hour in a strange man's house. So she hung the apron on the peg and left the oilcloth folded, and went and made supper out of what the sad shelves held. And it was better than anything that kitchen had turned out in 2 years. And Amos ate it without a word, and did not know how to say so. That night, when the man and the child were bedded, and the house had gone to its creaking, Wren took the lantern down off the kitchen nail and let herself out the back and walked down through the cold, wet grass to the hives. She set the lantern in the grass a little off, so as not to rouse them if there was anything left to rouse, and she went along the row and laid her bare hand flat on the top of the first weathered box the way her father had taught her before she could read, and she read the colony through her palm the way another woman might read a fevered child's forehead. There was nothing. A cold that was only the night's cold, no answering warmth of a wintered cluster, no faint drowsy thrum under the wood. She went down the row hand after hand and read them all, and it was the same. And where a hive was not wholly dead, it was worse than dead. She caught, at 2 of them, the sour reek of disease in the comb, and at another the ragged, robbed-out look of a weak colony that stronger robbers had torn the sweetness out of and left to starve, and everywhere the gray webbing and mess of the wax moth moving in the way it only moves into hives no one is tending. Queenless, most of them, or queened by failures, undoctored, unfed, unwatched, left through 2 hard winters to the mercy of every small enemy that a kept bee is kept from. This was not bad luck. This was neglect, plain and total, the neglect of a grieving man who had lost the one hand that knew how, and it had killed the yard as surely as a fire would have, only slower. And she understood, kneeling there with her bare palm on the cold dead wood, the whole shape of it at once, clean as arithmetic. The hives were dying of neglect, and the orchard was barren, not from any curse in its blood, but simply because there were no strong bees left to carry the bloom from tree to tree. And a farm can die for years of a thing that patient hands could mend in a season. She understood that, much surely, and under it, at the very edge of what she could yet name, she felt something else. A wrongness that had nothing to do with this yard, a slack line gone taut somewhere off in the district's honey trade. In the way a whole high country of good bee ground had been let go quiet, and its farms allowed to fail one after another, as if something were feeding on the failing. She could not name it yet. She only marked it, the way she had marked the cold honey house and the men on the porch, and folded it away. 2 things she knew clean, kneeling in the dark, that this place was dying of neglect and of some crooked hand she could not yet see, and that it could be saved, all of it, the hives and the orchard and the man and the note, by exactly and only the thing she knew how to do, and that not one soul in this county would believe that of the quiet housekeeper who had stepped off the evening stage, not yet, not for a long while, and that she would have to earn the right to be believed one silent morning at a time before she ever said a word of it aloud. So she said no word of it. She picked up the lantern and went back up through the wet grass to the leaning house and lay down in the narrow bed with her father's broken-spined journal within reach of her hand. And she was up in the black, before any man on the place had stirred, and when Amos Trine came stiff and unwilling into his cold kitchen at first gray light. The fire was going, and the coffee was hot and drinkable for the first time in 2 years, and the tall, quiet widow he had almost sent back down the mountain was already at the window, looking down the slope at his dead and silent bees. The house told on itself over the next week the way a sick man tells on himself to the one nurse who does not talk. And Wren Halloran led it, because a thing that is dying will confess if you only keep your hands busy and your mouth still, and set a good hot plate in front of it 3 times a day. She learned it in pieces, over meals, the way you learn the shape of a room in the dark by the barked shin and the found doorframe. She learned that Amos Trine had not built the place, but inherited it, that his father had come up into the high-fruit country above Quill Hollow with a grand notion and half a knowledge, had planted the orchard broad and handsome in rows that pleased the eye, and set the trees where the cold pooled and the bloom came too early, had run the bees the way a proud man runs anything he has read a pamphlet about, which is to say confidently and wrong, and Amos had learned it all from that father the way a boy learns a language before he knows there is any other, so that the errors sat in him, plain as grammar, and he could no more see them than he could see his own accent. She learned that the good years had been his wife's years. Nobody said it that way. It came sideways, in the girl's silence and the old hand's talk and the particular way Amos would not look at the honey house, but Wren pieced it, that Sarah Trine had been the one who truly kept the bees, who went veiled and unhurried into the yard on the still June evenings, who candled the new honey against a window to read its clearness, who knew a queen the way some women know the tempers of their children, and that when the fever took her 2 winters back it had taken the bees with her, quietly, as if the colonies had been hers on some understanding the men of the house were never party to, and saw no reason to honor a widower they did not know. Since then the apples had not set. 3 springs of white bloom foaming over those crooked handsome rows, and 3 autumns of nothing, of leaves and bare wood and the branches lifting empty into the cold, and the honey crop dwindling year over year, until this last season it had come to almost nothing. A few thin, dark combs Amos had carried to town half ashamed. And there was the note. She heard of the note first from the old hand, and then, once, from Amos himself, who said it flat as a man saying the barn needs a new sill, that there was money owed the county bank at Quill Hollow against the place, and that it came due at harvest. The old hand's name was Barnabas Yoke, though everyone shortened it to Barney, a garrulous, stooped widower who had worked the Trine grounds since before Amos was breeched, and could no more keep a fact to himself than a sieve can keep water, and it was Barney, over the 3rd or 4th supper, gumming her light bread and going soft-eyed at the taste of it, who told her the banker was a man named Pruitt. Ezra Pruitt, an exact man, a cold-seeming, fair-seeming man who added his columns twice and had carried Amos's note past due 2 times already out of some private arithmetic of decency, and had said the last time, kindly and finely, that he could not do it a 3rd, that the bank was not his own pocket, that a note was a note, and a crop was a crop, and the 2 would have to be made to meet at harvest, or the ground would answer for the difference. Wren said nothing to any of it. She had learned long since that a woman who says the true thing too soon is a woman who has said it into the wind, and she had a great deal she could have said. Standing at that range with her back to the room, listening to a farm recite the exact manner of its own ruin. She let it recite. She kept her figures instead in a small cloth-covered book she had brought west folded in among the aprons, and at night by the low lamp she set down what the meals had told her, the years and the acreage and the owed money and the dead wife's name, in a small square hand, the way her father had taught her to set down anything you meant to trust later, because a thing written down cannot lie to you the way a thing remembered can. It was on the town buying trip that she first laid eyes on Dorsey chalk, and knew, the way you know a rope has gone taut somewhere out of sight when the whole rigging shifts a half-inch, that the ruin she had been listening to over supper had a second cause, and that this was the man. Amos had driven her down for stores, $4 grudged out of a lard tin, and a list she had pared to the bone. And while she stood at the counter of the mercantile pricing flour against cornmeal, a big, warm, handsome man came in off the boardwalk trailing a smell of good tobacco and pomade, and stopped, and turned, and was pleased to meet her. And she was got at once and expertly, the way a fish is got. He was the honey buyer, he said, the commission man, Chalk of Chalk and Company, who took the district's honey east and got the district a fair price for it, which was more than the district could get for itself. Poor, scattered producers that they were. And wasn't she the new woman up at Trines? And how did she find the old place? And hadn't the hives up there gone very quiet these last years? A shame. A real shame. Such good ground, and did she happen to know had Emulse any thought of what he'd do come harvest? 3 questions in the shape of pleasantries, each one a hand feeling along a wall for the give in it. She answered him plain and short, and gave him nothing. Said she found the place well enough, and kept the house and knew little of bees, which was the second lie she had told in Oregon and the more deliberate one, and she watched a small cold satisfaction move behind his warm face at the word little, the way a man's face settles when the ledger comes out the way he wanted it to. He was pleased she knew nothing. That was the thing she carried home in the wagon and could not yet make into a sentence, that a man ought not be pleased to learn a farm's new hand is ignorant, unless the farm's ignorance is somewhere on his side of the account. She wrote his name in the little book that night, with nothing after it but a line. The way you'd mark a hive you meant to come back and open when the light was better. But it was the child she went at first, before the hives, before the man. Because Wren Halloran had buried enough of her own to know that a house does not truly begin to mend until its smallest grief is taken up and held. And the smallest grief in the Trine house had a name, and the name was Nettie. Nettie Trine was 9 and had not left her father's shadow since the fever took her mother. She trailed him to the barn and back, ate what was set before her without tasting it, answered when spoken to and no more, and regarded Wren across those first suppers with the flat, unblinking wariness of a creature that has already learned that things it loves are taken. Wren did not court her. She had watched women court frightened children, with sweets and questions and bright false gaiety, and had watched the children close over like water. She simply, on the 4th or 5th evening, took down from the honey house a jar of the last poor dark honey Sarah Trine had ever put up, one Amos had not been able to bring himself to sell or to open, and set it on the table with a candle behind it, and said to no one to the room that her own mother had taught her you could read a honey by its light, that a clear honey was a well-kept honey and a clouded one had a story in it, and she held the jar to the flame and turned it slow. And Nettie, who had not volunteered a word in a fortnight, said in a small, rusty voice that her mother used to do that. She used to hold them up. Wren did not turn, did not pounce, she said only, was that so? And that her mother must have kept good bees then, and held the jar a moment longer, and then handed it across to the child to hold to the light herself, as if it were nothing, as if the child's mother were not the whole broken center of the house. And Nettie held the jar in 2 hands to the candle and looked into the deep amber of it, and something in her small face came unlocked that had been locked 2 winters. There was a tune in it, too. After that, a low wordless thing Wren hummed at the range without seeming to mean anything by it, and one evening Nettie hummed a few notes of it back before she caught herself, and Wren gave no sign she had heard, which was how she worked, and there was a penny. An honest copper penny, paid the girl for stringing dried apple rings on thread to hang over the stove, real wages for real work so the child should learn what her father's whole trouble was, that a thing done ought to be weighed true and paid true. No one saw any of it happen. Amos, coming in cold from the barn, saw only that his daughter had begun to sit nearer the woman than to the door, and could not have said when it started. After that the child was Wren's, quietly and altogether, the way a queen is a colony's, without any vote being taken. And through all of it, the arrangement stayed exactly what it had been written to be. There was no sentiment in the house, and Wren wanted none. She had come for the bees, though no one knew it. And a widow with a trade the world would not let her own has learned to want nothing she cannot put in a book and add up. Amos paid her the housekeeper's wages they had agreed, found and a little money, counted out awkwardly on the last day of the week, and she took it and said thank you and wrote it down, and that was the whole of what passed between them that could be called an understanding. What passed that could not be called anything was that she kept his sagging house on that thin money better than it had been kept since Sarah, and he could not help but see it, and could not think how to say so, and so said nothing. She bought like a woman who had been poor in more places than her purse. She bought the cheap cut and made it eat like the dear one, saved every spoon of drippings in a crock and cooked out of it a week later, set the bread rising the night before, so the kitchen woke to that good yeasty warmth ahead of any man, took the scorched, bitter, store-kept coffee Amos had been drinking like a penance, and did something to it with an egg and a pinch of salt so that Barney Yoke, tasting it, set his cup down and looked into it, and said aloud that he had not had coffee fit to drink in this house since the Lord was a boy, and looked at Wren with a wet-eyed frank amazement, and was, from that cup forward, hers. So was the hard old freighter Ostheim, a leathery, skeptical producer who hauled the district's poor honey down to Chalk's scales and had stood on the boardwalk that first day and priced her low along with the rest, and who came by on some errand and got fed at the table because that was what the table did now, and who ate 2 plates of what she set before him in a working silence and pushed back and said, grudging, to Amos, that the man had done better than he'd any right to expect out of a hired woman, which was as near a benediction as Ostheim came to anything, and which he would live to eat as thoroughly as he had eaten her dinner. Plate by plate she was earning them, the men who had priced her in a single pass, and not one of them knew he was being earned. And that too was how she worked. She did not speak her real trade. Twice already the world had shown her what came of that, of a woman claiming a man's craft before she had been made too useful to refuse. Once at a great bee yard in Indiana, where she had come with her father's journal under her arm and her father's knowledge in her hands, and been told, courteously, by men who could not have requeened a failing colony to save their lives, that they did not hire women to the bees, and once later, worse, driven off a place in the Nebraska sandhills where she had let it be known too plainly what she could do, by men who did not like to be shown, and had made the showing a grievance. She had learned the price of the true thing said too soon, so she said nothing, and rose before any man, and went out in the gray before dawn into the neglected apiary at the orchard's edge with a lantern and her father's veil folded in her apron, and did there, alone, unwitnessed, the first plain quiet work of a craft nobody on the place knew she owned. She opened the least dead of the silent gray boxes, the one she had marked her first night as not yet gone all the way over, and found in it what she had read through the wood with her bare hand, a colony robbed thin and queenless and choked with the gray webbing of wax moth, but with a fistful of tired old bees still clinging on out of that dumb loyalty a hive keeps to the memory of itself. She cleaned it with her hands in the cold, scraped out the ruined moth-eaten comb, cut away the fouled dead, set it right frame by frame the way her father had set right 100 like it, and closed it gentle before the sun could chill the few that were left, and set down in the little book every honest figure of it, the count and the condition and the date. It was almost nothing. It was one poor box among a yard of dead ones, and no man saw her do it, and the note still stood, and Chalk's scales still weighted down in town like a mouth. But when she laid her bare hand flat on that box the next dawn to read it, there was, under her palm, faint as a pulse coming back into a cold wrist, the first thin thread of a sound that had not been in the yard when she came. And Wren Halloran stood in the gray light over her father's veil, with her hand on the wood a long moment, and did not smile, because smiling was not a thing she spent. But something in her went as still and certain as a plumb line finding true, and she knew, the way she knew weather, that she had begun. The nursing of that first silent hive did not stay a secret from the bees, though it stayed one from the men. By the time the alders leafed out and the wild plum went white along the fence lines, Wren had her hands in every colony on the place, and she worked them the way another woman would have worked a garden gone to weed, patiently, in the cool of the morning before the men were up, in the long gold hour after supper when Amos was at his books and Nettie was heavy-lidded by the stove. She had found, that first fortnight, exactly what her bare palm had told her the first night. Some of the hives were not dying, but already dead, gone hollow and gray with the little grief of a colony that has queened itself out and given up. Some were choked with the ropey foul of disease that no man on the place had the eye to name. Some were being robbed thin by their own stronger neighbors. A slow civil war carried on in the yard while Amos passed by twice a day and heard only quiet, and called the quiet peace. Wren did not call it peace. She knew the difference between a hive at rest and a hive at its end, the way a nurse knows the difference between a child asleep and a child sinking, and she went at the ruin one box at a time, unhurried, giving nothing away. The dead ones she scorched and scraped and set out clean in the sun to sweeten. The diseased she culled without sentiment, burning the black comb in a pit behind the honey house at dusk so the smoke would not drift into town and start talk, and she washed her hands and her tools in a strong lie between each so the sickness would not walk from one hive to the next on her own fingers. The weak she fed, and the queenless, the true heart of the matter, the reason the yard had gone silent and the orchard barren both. The queenless she made whole from the small square cage of virgin queens she had carried, folded in oilcloth beneath her one good dress, the last daughters of a line her father had bred 40 years and her grandfather before him. A line that had crossed the Ohio and the Mississippi and the Platte in a padded box on a woman's lap, and had never once, in all that traveling, been allowed to die. She slipped a caged queen into a broken colony the way she might slip a warm stone into a cold bed, and she waited. And in 3 days or 4 the workers would eat through the candy plug and take the stranger for their own. And a hive that had been a gray coffin would put out the low, even, laboring hum of a house with a mother in it again. That hum was the thing. Amos noticed the hum before he noticed anything, because it reached him where he was not looking. He would be splitting stove wood at the block or leading the mare down to water, and there would come, from the orchard's edge where the leaning boxes stood, a sound that had not been on that place in 2 years. Not a bee here and a bee there, but a body of sound. A warm, low roar under the birdsong, the particular music of 10,000 wings moving air on purpose. He stopped the first time he heard it, and stood with the axe hanging, and did not know his own face had changed. Sarah's yard had sounded like that. He had forgotten he knew the sound, and here it was, come back into the world without his leave, and he turned and looked toward the hives a long moment, and then went on splitting wood and said not one word, because saying it would have made it his to lose again. But the true masterstroke, the thing that turned the whole place on its hinge, Wren did in the apple bloom, and she did it so quietly that a man watching would have sworn he saw nothing at all. For the orchard was the riddle under the riddle. Amos's trees were sound. She had walked every row and read the wood and the set of the buds, and found them honest, well pruned in their day, grafted to good fruiting stock by a father who had loved them if he had not understood them. They bloomed. God knew they bloomed. In the 3rd week of that spring, the whole hillside above Quill Hollow foamed pink and white, and threw its scent down into the town, and Amos looked at it the way he had looked at it for 3 springs running, with the flat dread of a man watching a thing be beautiful and come to nothing, because for 3 years that bloom had blown its petals off in a fortnight and set no more than a scatter of runt fruit, a handful of knotty windfalls where a crop should hang, and no man could tell him why. He blamed the soil. He blamed a curse on the ground his father had broken. He blamed himself, in the dark the loudest. He never once thought to blame the silence, because he did not know, had never been told, had learned his bees from a father who had figured the whole trade out alone in a new country and figured half of it exactly backward, that an apple tree does not fruit on beauty, it fruits on carriage. The pollen must be carried, blossom to blossom, tree to tree, and there is only one drayman for that freight in the high-fruit country, and it comes on wings. And Amos's draymen had all died in their boxes 2 winters gone, and no one had thought to say so. Wren said nothing either. She only, when the bloom broke, moved her strongest hives, the re-queened ones, boiling now with young bees hungry for the first flow of the year, up into the orchard on a stone boat in the dark, set them square in the rows where the bloom hung thickest, and turned the whole roaring appetite of 40,000 bees loose into the trees. And the bees, asking no one's leave and drawing no wage, did in 9 days what 3 years of a good man's worry had not done. They worked the bloom flower by flower, dusted gold from tree to tree on their legs and their backs without knowing they carried anything at all, and set the fruit. The bloom fell, as it always fell. But this time, where the petals dropped, the small hard green nubs stayed on, thousands of them, tight to the wood, swelling, a set crop, the first the Trine orchard had carried in 3 years, and it had cost nothing but the knowing. She did not announce it, she let him find it. It was the old hand who found it first, in truth. Gideon Poe, the neighbor's man who had helped Amos's father set the last of the trees and had a mouth on him that ran like a creek in spring, and could no more keep a thing to himself than a sieve could keep water. Gideon came up the orchard row on a warm forenoon to borrow back a froe, saw Wren's boxes standing in the trees and the bees going up into the bloom like smoke drawn to a flue, and then saw, when he stopped and squinted, the little green set fruit thick on a branch that had given him nothing but disappointment for 3 seasons, and the old man went quiet in a way Wren had not heard him go quiet before. She was there, and Nettie was there beside her with a jar in her hands, and the laid-over freighter Desiree, a hard, sun-cured old producer down from the ridge waiting on his team to be shod, a man who had told the loafers on the store porch that a woman kept bees the way a cat kept the Sabbath. Desiree was there too, come up idle to see what the talk was about. And Wren, who had planned nothing and let none of it show she had planned it, did the only demonstration she ever gave that whole season, and it looked like nothing. She walked them 3 trees down the row to a hive she had marked, the reeking gray dead-looking box that Gideon himself had told Amos to burn for kindling a month past, and she lifted the lid off it in the plain daylight with her bare hands and no smoke and let them look in. And where a month ago There had been black comb and moth web and the sour of a dead thing. There was now clean white new comb wired tight across the frames, wall-to-wall brood in a perfect laying pattern, capped honey coming in gold at the corners, and over it all the bees moving thick and orderly and calm as a congregation, that even laboring hum rolling up into the men's faces warm as breath. She did not lecture. She held a frame up to the sun so the light came through the new wax the color of a lit lamp, and she turned it once, slow, so they could see the set of the brood, and she said only, in that level voice of hers that fell like a fresh-drawn frame set square in its box, that the tree above them had gone barren for the same reason this hive had gone quiet, and that the one had been the cure of the other all along, and there had never been a curse on the ground. Then she set the frame gently back and put the lid on, and let them stand there in the hum with the green fruit thick over their heads, and that was the whole of it. Gideon Poe told it in town before nightfall. Of course he could not help it, and it did not come out the way the loafers wanted it to. Old Desiree said nothing at all for a long while, which for Desiree was a confession, and when he came down off the ridge that fall he would remember standing in that orchard row. It was that same evening, with the smell of the burnt cull comb still faint on the air and the hum going low and settled in the dark yard, that Amos asked her at last. She was at the range with her back half turned to him, working the coffee she had made drinkable out of his cheap burnt beans, and he was at the table with the lamp and the ledger he had not opened, and he said, not looking up, that a woman did not learn what she had shown them today, keeping a man's kitchen, and he would like to know who it was he had let into his house. And Wren told him, plain, her hands never stopping, her back never fully turning, because it was easier to lay a life down on the air than to lay it in a man's face. 4 generations, she said. Ohio. Her people had kept bees on the Muskingum bottoms since before the war with Britain, and her father had carried her out into the bee yard on his arm before she could walk and stood her in the roar of it and taught her queens and comb and the turn of the weather and the reading of a bloom the way other fathers taught the alphabet, so that she had known the smell of a queenless hive before she knew her letters, and could tell a swarm 3 days off by the sound of it. She had married a good man, she said, Josiah Halloran, a wheelwright with a gentle hand and no fear of the bees, which was rarer in a man than she had known to be grateful for. And she had followed him west with a padded box of her father's queens on her lap. And she had buried him of a fever on the far side of the Snake in ground she could no longer find. And she had spent the 8 years since cooking and washing and keeping other people's houses across 4 territories. Because a widow with a trade will still starve in this country if the trade is one no man will let her name out loud. Twice she had tried. Once a bee yard had turned her off the property when they saw whose hands were reaching for the veil. Once a man had hired W. Halloran by the letter, and unhired her by the face on the same afternoon. So she signed with the initial and folded her tools under her dress and cooked, and she had read his notice in a boarding house in the Dalles the way a half-froze hand reads warmth off a rail on a cold night. Not for the man in it, she said. And she said it without cruelty and without apology, only as the true thing it was. But for the yard behind the man, the silent yard she could hear from clean across the mountains was dying and could be brought back. She had come for the bees. Amos took that a long moment. Then he said only that it was honest of her to say so, and that the coffee was better than his father ever made, and he opened the ledger, and neither of them said any more. But something in the house had shifted its weight, quiet as a hive taking to a new queen. What cracked his guard the first time was the hail. It came the 3rd week of June out of a green-black sky that stacked up over the ridge in an afternoon, and it came for the set fruit. for the whole tender green crop hanging its first real promise in 3 years, and it came worst of all for the yard. For the boxes standing out in the orchard rows with their new comb and their laying queens, and no man's roof over them. Wren was out the door before the first stones bounced, and Amos was out behind her without deciding to be, and Nettie in the doorway crying. And for 2 hours in the roar and the white lash of it, the two of them fought that storm side by side, dragging planks and old doors and the wagon sheet up over the hives, staking them, weighting them with stone against a wind that wanted to roll them, standing bodily between the driving ice and the boxes when there was nothing left to cover them with, both of them soaked and hammered and past speech. When it broke and blew off east and the sun came out sick and yellow on a world glazed white and steaming, half the fruit was down and bruising in the grass, and the two of them stood in the wreck of the orchard, streaming water, breathing hard. And Amos looked at her, bareheaded, her hair down and plastered, a welt rising on her cheekbone where a stone had caught her, standing in the ruin of his crop, counting his hives with her eyes to see which had held, and he did not say the thing that rose in him. He had sworn off saying such things 2 years back, and paid the note on that vow every morning. But he took off his own soaked coat, uselessly, and put it around her shoulders, and she let him, and that was all, and it was a great deal. The crop that was left set on and swelled through July, and the yard came up strong and swarming, and the supers began to fill, box on box of new comb going heavy in gold, the first real honey the Trine place had made since Sarah candled her last jar, and the whole hillside humming rich in the warm dusk. And into that returning richness Dorsey Chalk came circling nearer. He drove up the orchard road one August forenoon in his good buggy, all warmth and pricing eyes, and he admired the bloom set and the fat supers and the mended hives with a merchant's flat pleasure, and he asked his 3 careful questions in the guise of neighborliness. And then he told Amos gently, man to man, that a place this far up the grade was a hard thing to hold with a note against it, and that he stood ready, as a kindness, he said, as an accommodation to a good man in a hard season, to take the burden of it off him for a fair figure before harvest closed the door. Amos said he'd think on it, which was not yes, and was not the flat no Wren would have given. And Chalk smiled and let it lie and drove off pleased, because a man who says he'll think on it is a man already half sold. And down at the depot that same week, at his tin weigh scales in the shadow of his warehouse, Chalk bought the district's honey in, took in honest comb from tired producers and set it on the pan, and read off a weight that ran light every time, a thumb's worth here, 2 pounds there, and graded good clear top flow honey down to a middling price with a click of his tongue and a sorrowful shake of the head, and paid thin and stacked it, and no one weighed after him because no one had a scale to weigh with, and no one had thought to doubt the man who bought the whole valley's crop. But Wren had begun to doubt. She said nothing. She had learned twice over what came of speaking too soon. But from the first jar the Trine place sold, she had begun a small book of her own, a plain reckoning kept in a tight hand, every super drawn, every pound of comb spun out, the grade of it read by an eye that had graded honey before it could read, the true weight taken on the little brass balance from her father's box before ever it went down the hill to Chalk's tin scale, and beside it, in the next column, what Chalk's scale said it weighed, and what Chalk's mouth said it graded, and what Chalk's hand paid. The 2 columns did not agree. They were never going to agree. And she knew it, and she wrote it all down and said not a word, and let the supers keep filling heavy and gold up in the orchard while the note came on toward harvest like weather stacking over the ridge, the bank's due date, and Chalk's rigged pan closing on the Trine place from 2 sides at once, and only a woman with a plain book and a true balance standing anywhere in the county who could yet see both jaws of the trap. By the third week of the honey harvest, Wren had 2 tally books, and she carried them differently. One she kept in plain sight on the kitchen shelf, the household book, flour and salt, and the price of nails, the kind of book a housekeeper is expected to keep and no man thinks to open. The other lived under her mattress tick, wrapped in the same oilcloth that had once hidden her veil and her smoker, and into it, in the small upright hand her father had drilled into her before she could spell her own name, she had set down every weight of every super she and Amos had drawn since the 1st of July. The honey house weighed on her own spring balance, the balance her father had checked against a brass standard weight in Ohio 30 years before, and that she trusted the way other people trusted Scripture. And beside each honest figure, in a second column, the weight Dorsey Chalk's tin scales gave the same comb when they hauled it to town. She had not set out to catch him. She had set out only to know her own crop, because a beekeeper who does not know to the pound what her hives have made does not know her hives, and knowing was the habit of 4 generations. But numbers laid in 2 columns will speak whether or not you ask them to, and by the 3rd week of harvest hers had begun to speak plainly. Chalk's scale ran light, not wildly, not in any single weighing a man could point to and swear over. 3 pounds on 40, 4 on 50, a shaving here and a shaving there. The loss of it small enough that any one producer would blame his own reckoning before he blamed the tin. But she had 30 weighings now, and 30 weighings do not lie the way one does. Across the season the tin had eaten better than a full super out of every 10, and it had eaten it from every man who hauled to Quill Hollow, not from her alone. She had only to stand at the scale on sale days with her household book open and her mouth shut and watch old Harlan Pruitt's 500 pounds come off Chalk's beam as 430 and be paid bottom grade on top of it, dark graded and docked. Honey that Wren had seen in the comb and knew for as clean a water-white clover as any yard in the district put up. The bees did not lie. The tin did. And behind the tin stood the man, warm and pricing and sorry as a mourner, telling Pruitt the market was soft back east and folks wouldn't pay for northern honey the way they had, and buying Pruitt's whole short-weighed, dark-graded crop at a price that left the old man owing his own note, and saying, gentle, that if it came to that, he'd take the Pruitt bee yard off his hands whenever Harlan was ready to be shut of the worry. That was the piece Wren had been slow to see, because it was the piece a person does not want to see. That the short weight and the low grade and the soft market talk were not 3 misfortunes, but one machine. And its purpose was not to shave a producer thin, but to grind a bee farm to the ground and buy it standing. She counted the failed yards Chalk had bought in 6 years, and there were 5 of them. 5 families gone down the road to the railhead with a buyer's kindness and a buyer's price in their pockets. And she understood. Sitting on the honey house step in the cool with the smell of boiling comb around her. That the Trine place was the 6th on his list, and that Amos's note coming due at harvest was the last turn of the screw. She might have gone to Amos that night. She did not, because a man ground down to caution does not act on his housekeeper's arithmetic against the one buyer in the district, and because she had learned in 8 years of the frontier that a thing shown is believed where a thing said is doubted, and she meant to show it. What decided the shape of the showing was a jar. On a town buying trip she had bought back one of Chalk's own, a squat jar with a printed paper label, Pure Quill Hollow Honey, the district's good clean name in blue letters. The honey he pooled from the crops he bought thin and shipped east deer, and she had carried it home the way you carry a thing you already half know. In the honey house by lamplight she'd broken the seal, and any beekeeper's eye read it before her tongue did. It poured a shade too bright and a shade too even. It held no least ghost of the clover and fireweed that any true Quill Hollow honey carried. It did not granulate at the neck the way clean honey will, but stood glassy and wrong. She warmed a spoon of it, and pulled it and watched it string thin and false. And she did the plain old test her father had taught her, a drop in water and another in strong spirits, and it clouded where clean honey would not. And she sat with the clouded glass in her hand a long while. He was cutting it. Glucose, corn syrup, the cheap Eastern stuff a grocer buys by the barrel, married into the district's honest honey and shipped under the district's honest name at the honest price, so that every jar of pure Quill Hollow that reached a Chicago table was a lie told in the district's voice. And the district was the last to know it was speaking. She wrapped the jar in cloth and set it under the mattress tick beside the tally book. 2 things now, the 2 columns and the clouded glass, and between them the whole of it. He weighs you light, grades you low, buys you cheap, cuts what he buys, sells the lie dear, and takes your land when you fall. She did not feel triumph. She felt the particular cold a beekeeper feels finding wax moth in a hive she thought she'd saved. The cold of a ruin that had been running quietly the whole time under the appearance of hard luck. And she had. She knew. Until the fall honey sale to make honest weight beat the tin in the open. Because the note came due the day of the sale, and Chalk's short, thin price would not clear it, and the farm would go to him at his kindness like the 5 before it. Unless the arithmetic were done where every producer could watch it done. The crisis came before the sale, the way weather always comes before you are ready for it. It came on an August night the color of a bruise, still and green in the west after a hot day, and Wren read it off the sky and off the hush in the yard where even the strong hives had drawn in. And she said one word to Amos at supper. Hail. And he looked at the honey house, half full of the first clean surplus crop in 3 years, and at the orchard hung heavy with the apples her bees had set, and he went the color of ash. There is no fighting hail. There is only the running before it. And they ran, the 2 of them and the child, and old Teal the neighbor, limping out with a lantern, cutting the heaviest boughs to prop before the ice could break them, hauling the drawn supers deeper into the stone honey house where the glass wouldn't take them, throwing sacking and the wagon canvas and the very quilts off the beds over the low nucleus hives Wren had built up all summer from nothing, the young colonies that were the whole of next year, while the wind came up out of the green dark smelling of ice, and the first stones came down the size of peas, and then the size of eggs, hammering the barn roof like a thing trying to get in. They stood it out in the honey house doorway, all 4, watching the orchard take it. The white blossom-set fruit knocked down in the dark, and Wren held the child against her, and felt Amos beside her with his hands hanging useless. A man watching the one crop he dared to hope on go down under the ice, and she did not tell him it would be all right, because she did not lie any better than her bees did. It passed in 20 minutes the way hail does, leaving the yard drifted white in August and the air gone cold and clean, and the drip of melt off every eve. By lantern in the wet gray of after they walked the rows, and it was bad, but it was not death, the ice had stripped 1/3 of the fruit and bruised more, but 2/3 hung on, battered and sound. More apples than the orchard had set in 3 years even after the loss, and the hives Wren had covered had come through, and the drawn honey was stone safe. Amos stood in the ruined and not ruined orchard with melt running off his hat brim, and something in him let go that had been held 2 years, and he said, low, not looking at her, that he'd covered his hives every hailfall his whole life and lost them anyway, and never once known to build the young ones up going into fall, so a loss like this wouldn't be the end of him. and that he'd been standing on this ground, failing at a thing his father failed at before him, and calling it bad country, when the whole time it was only that nobody had ever showed him. And then, still not looking at her, in the plain broken way of a careful man saying a thing that costs him, he told her the rest, that he was still afraid, that he woke some mornings with Sarah's name already in his mouth before he was awake enough to stop it, and that 2 winters back, burying her, he had decided that wanting anything again was a debt he would not take up a second time, because he had paid the first one to the bottom of himself and had nothing left to pay with. That he had hired a housekeeper the way a man orders seed, meaning to keep the house quiet and dare nothing and lose the place slow, and instead a woman had walked into his dead orchard and made it hum. And that he had run out of the smaller names for what he felt, help and luck and gratitude, and was left holding the true one and no cheaper word to hide it under. He said he was not asking to rescue her. Anybody with eyes could see it ran the other way, that she was the one doing the saving, and the whole county half knew it now, but that he had watched what this country did to women who built things without a name on the paper, and he would not have that be her. And he was asking if she would have a scared middling orchardist who had nothing but a mortgaged place she'd made worth mortgaging, for a real marriage and her name beside his on the deed and on the honey, a partner and not a hired hand. He said it badly. He said it with his hat in his hands and hail melting down his collar and half of it aimed at the mud, and it was worth 10 of any speech, because a speech is easy, and this had cost him everything he had left. Wren was quiet a long time, long enough that the child looked up between them. Then she told her own, because he had been square with her and she would be square with him. She told him there was a husband under the grass somewhere back along the emigrant road, and a grave she had never found again, and could not have found if her life hung on it, and that standing it where she thought it was, she had made a vow to God and the wind never again to love a thing this country could reach out and take, because loving and losing on this ground had nearly finished her, and she had promised herself she would not be finished. She said she had come for the bees and not for him, and that this was still true, and that it had stopped being the whole truth somewhere back in July, and she had been slow to write down that column too. And then she did the thing that was hers to do, the honest weighing, and asked him the only question that mattered, whether he was asking her because the crop was in and the farm was worth having, or whether the asking would still stand if the sale went wrong and Chalk took the place out from under them both, and there was nothing left to put her name on but debt. Amos looked up from the mud at that and held her eyes and said it would stand, that he wasn't asking for the farm, that he'd have asked her in the spring when the orchard was dead if he'd had the sense to know it then. And Wren, who had come west swearing never to love a thing this country could take, stood in the melting hail and let herself be taken, and said yes, plain, no more word than that, the way you say a true wait. There was a marriage in it now instead of an arrangement, unwed still, promised in a wet orchard with a lantern going out, and neither of them made more of the saying than it would bear. It was the child who made it whole. She had been standing between them the whole while with the hem of her nightdress soaked, and when the yeses were said she tugged Wren's wet sleeve and asked, careful, the way children ask a thing they have been holding a long time, what she was to call her now. Not Mrs. Halloran, which was the housekeeper, and not Mother, which was Sarah and always would be, and the child knew it and Wren knew it, and neither would take that name off the grave. Wren knelt in the cold mud so their eyes were level, the way she knelt to read a hive, and told her she could call her Wren, plain, the way her own people back in Ohio had called each other across the bee yard, a name and not a station, and that Sarah had kept the bees on this place before either of them, and candled the honey and sung to the child in the cradle, and that nothing they built now would put Sarah down, that a hive keeps every generation of comb it ever drew and builds new on the old, and none of it is lost. The child thought about that a while in the dark, and then said, "All right, Wren," trying it, and hummed the little tune her mother had hummed candling honey, the tune Wren had taught back to her a month before, without either of them saying whose it was. And that was the whole of the ceremony, and worth more than the one to come. So it stood, going into the fall honey sale, with the note due that same day and the trap sprung and set. Wren had her 2 columns and her clouded jar and her father's honest balance, and she had, for the first time, someone standing beside her who knew what she carried and had asked her to carry it under his name. And the farm's fate and the fraud's undoing came down now to a single autumn morning in Quill Hollow, when the same comb would be weighed on 2 scales in front of every producer in the district, and the arithmetic would be let to speak for itself. She did not mean to shout the word cheat. She had never once in her life had to shout at a hive to make it tell the truth, and she did not mean to start with men. The honey went east that fall under no man's thumb but their own, and the note fell before it. It happened without ceremony, the way the true turnings of a life mostly do. A morning in the honey house with the stone floor cold under their boots and the tin scale, the honest one, standing where Chalk's rigged article had once done its quiet lying. Cade Ferris, the exact man banker who had carried the trine note twice and sworn he could not carry it a third time, came up the graded track in his black coat with his ledger under his arm and did the arithmetic himself, out loud, the way a fair man will when he wants no doubt left standing between him and another man. He weighed the crop true. He read the grade off the comb with his own thumb pressed to the cappings, white and even and pure as milk. And he named it top, and he named the price it fetched at top, and when he had the sum, he set it against the principal and the interest both, and found, to a certainty that made the old man take his spectacles off and rub them a long while on his sleeve, that Amos Trine owed the county bank not $1. It was paid. It was paid early, and it was paid whole. And the Trine place came into that season owing no man alive a cent for the first time since Amos's father had walked the ground with a bag of seedling stock and a head full of grand half-wrong notions, and planted an orchard he never lived to see bear right. Ferris shook Amos's hand and held it a moment longer than the transaction asked. And he said, in the flat, careful voice of a man who deals all day in what things are actually worth, that he had held a good many notes in his time and watched a good many places go down under them, and that he had never once before seen a farm pulled back up out of that particular hole by a woman with a smoker and a queen cage and a book of honest figures, and that he was glad, purely glad, to have been wrong about the odds. And Dorsey Chalk's shadow, which had lain so long and cool across the whole district that men had come to mistake it for weather, went off the county not with a hanging and not with a trial, but in the plainest way a lie can go, by standing beside the truth in daylight, until nobody could look at the two of them and pretend not to see which was which. No charge was ever laid against him. A market cheat is a slippery thing to hang. The scale had been retrued, and the glucose was gone down the drain, and the district had no stomach for the lawyering it would take to prove what every producer in it now knew in his bones. But Quill Hollow, which will forgive a man an honest failing and a hot word and a bad harvest, does not forgive a thing quietly attempted against it in the dark, and it did not forgive Chalk. They simply stopped coming to his door, one by one, and then all at once the wagons that had rolled to his tin scales for a dozen years rolled past them, and the comb that had gone into his adulterated barrels went instead into the clean, pooled crop of honest men. And when his Eastern buyers set his cut Quill Hollow honey beside the real graded article that now came out of the district under its own true name, they tasted the difference a child could taste, and they wrote him no more orders. His barrels sat, his scales sat. He carried, for a season, the particular loneliness of a man who has been found out by a whole valley and told nothing to his face. And it was a heavier freight than any writ, and in the end he sold out his store and his lease and his empty barrels for what he could get, and drifted down the grade to the railhead, a smooth pricing man gone gray at the edges, and Quill Hollow closed over the place where he had stood the way still water closes over a dropped stone. He was not spoken of much after. That was his whole punishment, and it was enough, and it was the kind of punishment the country metes out to the men it cannot jail. It simply declines, forever and without heat, to trust them again. What rose in the space his going left was the thing Wren had been building all along, without once saying she was building it. The producers of the high-fruit country, who had spent their working lives each alone at a crooked scale taking whatever thin figure a smiling man chose to write down, came together that winter in the cold stone of a shared honey house, and made a cooperative of themselves, pooled their crop, weighed it on one true scale before witnesses, graded it fair and hard by a standard they set among themselves and would not bend, and shipped it east under the name Quill Hollow, clean and pure and cut with nothing, at the top price the honest article had always deserved and never once been paid. It was Wren's honest scale they set at the center of it, and Wren's book of figures they took for a pattern, though she stood at the back of the room while they did it, and let the men think it was their own idea, which is how she had always done her best work. A co-op honey house, not a bridge, not a strike of luck, not a chest of gold pried out of a wall, just a plain building where the weight told the truth and every man got what his comb was worth. That was the shape of the victory, and it was the right shape, because it could not be bought back or bled again. A rigged scale can ruin one man at a time in the dark, but 100 men weighing true in the light have no dark left in them for a chalk to work. The orchard bore that year the way it had not borne in living memory. The bees Wren had requeened and cleaned and built strong went out into the bloom in their tens of thousands and did the old patient uncelebrated work of carrying one flower's gold to the waiting heart of the next. And the apples set where 3 barren springs had given nothing, set so heavy that Amos had to prop the laden limbs with poles cut from the woodlot lest they break under their own richness. The hum came back into the yard and stayed, that deep, full, working sound of a strong apiary in July, the sound Wren had read the absence of with her bare hand that first black night, and known for the sound of a place dying. It filled the air now from first light to dusk, the audible heartbeat of the farm, and Amos, who had lived 2 years inside a silence he had stopped even hearing, would sometimes stop with a bucket in his hand and just listen to it like a man listening to rain after a long drought. And the town, which had priced Wren in one contemptuous pass off the stage that first spring and found her wanting, recalculated her the way it had recalculated everything else, slowly, grudgingly, and then completely. The hard old producer freighter Obed Rall, who had stood on the store porch that first day and said within her hearing that Amos Trine had gone and hired himself a woman to do a man's ruined work and would learn what that bought him, ate his crow in full and did it, to his credit, with both hands. He came up the track late in the summer of the good crop, hat literally turned in his fingers, and stood in the door of the humming honey house and told Amos that he had been wrong on the porch about the woman who stepped off the stage, wrong as a man could be, and that he had said it loud and meant it to sting, and he'd come to unsay it just as loud. And when the wedding was set, a small one, for they were neither of them people who mistook noise for meaning, Old Rawl asked, turning his hat again, whether he might have the honor of some small part in it, some standing up, some carrying, anything a wrong-headed old man might do to square a debt he'd run up with his mouth. They gave him the giving of the bride, there being no other soul to do it, and he wept doing it, the hard old freighter, and was not ashamed. They wed in the orchard in the last of the apple bloom, with the hives humming heavy at the rose end, and it was a plain thing and a true one. There was no speech. Amos had never in his life made a speech and did not begin then. He took her hand in his own scarred, careful one and said the plain words a man says, and meant every one down to the ground, and that was the whole of it. The love between them had never once shown itself in speeches and did not start now. It showed the way it had always shown, in small concrete acts a body could point to. In the pole he cut and set under the heaviest laden limb, so the fruit she'd brought would not break the tree that bore it. In the honey she strained clear and jarred, and set by his plate without a word, because he'd said once, offhand 2 winters back, that Sarah used to, in the fact that he had put her name on the deed beside his own before ever he put a ring on her hand, because he had seen with his own eyes what the world does with unnamed women who build things, and would not have it done to her. And the child. The child was the first thing Wren ever mended on that place, and was, in the deep way of it, hers before anything else was. Pella had come to her over a pan of candling honey and a hummed tune her dead mother used to hum, one small shared task at a time, and after that the girl was Wren's, and no one had seen it happen, which is how the truest bonds are always made. The grace of it came on an ordinary afternoon in the honey house, no one else by, the light coming gold through the one window, and the tune going between them low, the way it always did now. The girl looked up from the frame she was learning to uncap, and she did not call her Mrs., and she did not call her Wren. She called her the name she had been turning over in her own heart all that long summer. The mother name. And she said it plain and then bent straight back to her work as though she had not just handed over the whole of her small guarded self. And Wren went on uncapping the frame beside her with her hand steady and her eyes not steady at all, and did not make a thing of it, because to make a thing of it would have been to frighten it, and she had spent her life learning not to frighten the living things that chose to come to her hand. There was still a penny between them, paid faithfully. For a task first done for a penny, there would always be the penny. It had long since stopped being wages, and become instead a small private word the two of them had that meant more than any dollar. And now move the years on, 3 of them, 4, and stand in the high fruit country above Quill Hollow on a spring evening, and see what became of it all. The road up to the Trine place is graded now, cut fair and kept, because the cooperative honey house sits partway along it, and the wagons come and go, and a valley looks after the roads its living runs on. The honey house itself is a busy place from the first flow to the last, the true scale at its heart weighing every man's crop the same, the grade set hard and honest, and the barrels going east under the name Quill Hollow the way the good clean article always should have gone, and for a dozen bled years did not. The county proud now of a thing it very nearly lost in the dark and never knew it was losing. And what strikes a body, standing there in the long light, is how entirely ordinary the whole of it was. There was no single grand stroke that saved the place, no fortune found, no villain struck down with a blow. There was only a woman who knew a trade and 1,000 small patient decisions to keep a living thing alive. A queen lifted from one hive and given to another. A reeking frame cleaned and set back. A scale trued. A figure written down honest in a plain book. A limb propped. A child hummed too. One flower's gold carried to the next, 10,000 of them, none worth the telling alone, and the sum of them a farm brought back from the grave, and a family made out of two people who had each sworn off wanting anything the country could take from them again. The bees do not lie. Men do, and did, and one man in particular did for a dozen years, and prospered at it until a woman set an honest weight beside his rigged one in the daylight. And that was the whole of the reckoning. Not a fight, not a hanging, just true weight standing next to false weight where every eye could see them both. That is the thing this country teaches, if it teaches anything, that the lie is always a lie about the weight, and the only answer to it is the true weight, plainly shown, and patience enough to let the difference speak. And the trade goes on, which is the part that would have astonished the 4 generations of Ohio beekeepers who came before. A line the world kept swearing was finished, swearing it when they said no woman could hold the craft, swearing it over a young husband's grave out west that Wren never could find again to lay a flower on, swearing it over the silent gray hives of a barren Oregon orchard the night she first laid her bare hand on the wood and read death in it through her palm. It was not finished. Go up in the warm dusk of an apple blossom evening, and you will see it carrying on, the 5th generation of it now. A girl grown tall and sure with the veil down over her face and the smoker going gentle in her hand. Reading a frame the way her mother taught her and her mother's father taught her mother, back and back, the trade handed down hive to hive, and hand to hand like a good queen line that will not fail. The orchard stands in bloom, every limb of it, white and heavy and humming. The strong hives at the row's end roar their deep, contented working roar into the falling light. Tens of thousands of bees going out and coming in, carrying the gold from flower to waiting flower for no wages and asking none. Doing the old work the way she taught the place, to stand back and let them do it. The honey house lamp is lit and burning steady down the graded road, and in the lighted door of the farmhouse Amos Trine and Wren stand a moment together in the last of the warm dusk with the hum washing up over them off the orchard, counting their people in off the cold road one by one as the evening comes down, the girl still out among the hives a while longer, because she cannot yet bear to leave them. The lamplight warm at their backs and the whole living working place breathing easy around them in the dark. Brought back, kept, and asking nothing more of the world than another spring.